we have to acknowledge some things here. First of all, that all the bloodshed here is 100% on the shoulders of Vladimir Putin and nobody else. This does not have to happen. But with that saying, he has been signaling for 15 years that NATO advancement to his border through Ukraine is a red line. And he has shown twice in 2008 and 2014 that he is willing to use force to limit it. As recently as December, Putin again said, hey, y'all aren't listening to me. I am deadly serious about this red line on Ukraine. And then he signaled again with this massive buildup of forces, which we just seem to want to ignore. We don't like it. We don't want to be told we can't do anything. What we should have done, and what even still is still possible in this now aftermath, is that we should have said, hey, Ukraine's never coming in NATO. This is not something that the alliance needs. They'll never qualify. So why should we say that this door is open when all that's going to do is get Ukraine sucked into a war? Because Putin was very clear on that. We made certain that everybody understood that they're not coming in NATO because every NATO nation has said we're not going to fight Russia on your behalf. Now, if you're not going to fight them, then why not do the one thing that might have precluded war and say the door is closed so that we take off the table Putin's red line, and then this may not have happened at all. But it did, and now that we've left the Ukrainians on their own, they're fighting this on their own. Nobody's coming to their aid, and so I think that they need to now take this bull by the horns and say, hey, we're gonna have to make some hard choices here, and that is if you declare neutrality right now, if you say we're not going to join NATO anymore, that's going to be a humiliating situation, but it could stop the war. If they, on the other hand, continue to say we're going to be brave, we're going to fight to the end, then all you're going to do is get lots of Ukrainians killed because they cannot stand up to this Russian military armada. They just can't do it. And that's the ugly place that we're in right now.
And I want to underline your point and get your sense on what we were thinking over the years. But to add to the context that you're talking about here. So in the wake of the Soviet Union, you have Ukraine and these other countries, on the western end of Russia. They split off and form their own countries. We end up supporting these kind of pro-democracy movements that end up overthrowing a bunch of kind of Russian-backed leaders. We then start expanding NATO, which was built to counter the Soviet Union. We start expanding NATO eastward. We add Lithuania on the border of Russia. We add Estonia on the border of Russia. We then add Georgia on the border of Russia, or we're about to add Georgia on the border. And Russia says, no, this is a red line. We told you don't add Georgia into NATO. And so they invade Georgia. And we follow that up then by supporting another pro-democracy movement in Ukraine, toppling a Russian-backed regime, and then trying to pull Ukraine into the NATO orbit. Russia follows that up with an invasion of Crimea immediately afterwards. We continue to try to pull Ukraine further and further. Was there anybody in Washington who said, why don't we just leave Ukraine alone and leave Ukraine as a sovereign country and a buffer state between Europe and Russia? Why was there so much push by the blob after everything as you said, as clear as Putin made it, invading Russia in 2008, invading Crimea in 2014, saying that this is a red line for me. If you keep doing this, we will take military action, and backing it up by twice doing that. Was there anybody in Washington saying, how about we just take him at his word and stop messing with Ukraine and just leave it as a sovereign buffer country between these two? Was anybody making that argument?
There wasn't very many. I mean, the defense priorities, my organization has been, which is one of the reasons I joined them, because they were one of the very consistent voices calling for this. But unfortunately, part of the problem, actually a major part of this problem, is that we came out of the Cold War and we, were very braggadocious about having won the Cold War, and now that it's a unipolar moment, et cetera. And so from basically 1992 forward, we said, hey, we don't have to listen to Russia. We don't have to listen to anything they say. We'll do whatever we want to do, and we're going to expand NATO. And, of course, they complained, time after time, Putin all the way back to 2007 in that famous Munich Security Conference where he first laid down the first marker, and we just continue to ignore them. Now, even as of the 2004, when they brought the Baltics, which did border Russia, into the alliance, these were still too weak to do anything. But they set about to make their military much better. They reformed it, they reorganized it, and they modernized it so that by 2008, they at least had enough to go into limited incursion into Georgia. And today, they are a very, very formidable conventional force, and we can no longer just tell them whatever we want to do. We now have to treat them as a major regional power. And look, this is not something we haven't done before. I mean, look at 1956. The Soviet Union invaded into Hungary, just like this, with tanks and everything. We didn't like it, but we made sure it didn't escalate beyond that. And we didn't go into with military power. We didn't threaten them further. And they stopped right there because they were worried about their internal security of the Soviet Union. Something like that still can happen here as long as we acknowledge reality that we no longer can just dictate to Russia what we want them to do. But that doesn't mean that our security is weakened because we still have power.
Right.
We still have 30 nations that have an Article 5 guarantee. Ukraine's not one of them, and Putin is not going to satisfy until he has that buffer.
Right now, however, I want to focus on the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The agency had admitted to withholding large portions of COVID data, including information on vaccine boosters, and fears that the data will be misinterpreted. The sampling data represents only 10% of the population, according to the CDC. So according to the New York Times, the CDC has only published a small amount of data over its collection the past 2 years. A CDC spokeswoman said the data, quote, is not yet ready for prime time. No rush. The Times notes that when the agency published the first significant data on the effectiveness of boosters in adults younger than 65, but left out the numbers for 18 to 49-year-olds, obviously a huge portion of that population. It's not the only data that the public hasn't seen. Last year, the CDC repeatedly came under fire for not tracking vaccinated people infected with the virus. Agency officials say the data is there, but has not been released because they may be interpreted as the vaccine being ineffective. Wouldn't want that.
Just give it to us straight, Doc. Like, just give us, stop trying to spin us. Stop trying to, well, if we tell them this, then what? Stop trying to game it out. These people are not, psychological theorists. They're just,
right, they're not.
They don't know how the public will take information.
If they were theorists, like on that level, they should all be fired because they didn't actually successfully.
Whatever they have done
right.
has helped fuel a vaccine-resistant movement.
And you've talked about how they did the testing thing the same way. They were reluctant to approve a lot of these tests.
Yeah.
Because they were worried that there might be some false negatives,
right.
And then people that felt as if they had symptoms might still go out, or if it was hard to actually reason all the way through their fear about having too many tests.
Their actual fear was like a bureaucratic fear of losing control of this. No, we want to be in charge of this. What if other people are doing things? We don't like that. We don't like when other people do things. We do things, not other people.
It's a huge lack of trust of the public. It was an inability to say, you're all adults, except the ones who aren't adults. Here is all the information. Be responsible, because if you're not, you or your loved one could die. Like, that really should be enough. And as you saw early in the pandemic, before the CDC was even telling people to mask up, people were masking up because they saw on the news that people were getting ventilators stuck down their throats. And we're like, you know what? That doesn't sound good. I'd like to avoid that.
Right, and they knew that Asian countries do that. They knew before the public health officials.
Right, the CDC, when they originally were like, oh, masks don't work, it's like, then why are all these Asian folks wearing masks?
Right.
And why do doctors and nurses wear masks in the hospital?
I mentioned this on the show yesterday, I think, but there's great information in Scott Gottlieb's new book about the pandemic response, about how the CDC was just utterly myopic from the beginning about data collection, about collecting the right data and making it available to the right people in the White House task force. Deborah Birx, in particular, was just like furious with basic incompetence on their part, and that they had to basically just do it. The White House task force had to do it themselves, had to figure out a system for getting this information because the CDC was just obstinately in the way.
It was so frustrating early on and throughout the pandemic that you kept getting statistics about how effective the vaccine was, and that was encouraging. That's why I took the vaccine. But they would never give you a statistic about what immunity from infection was doing when it came to resistance to a future infection. Like, just people are still going to get the same number of people would still get the vaccine, actually probably more if you treated them with more respect along the way. So, because then it doesn't become an us versus them, what are you hiding? It's like, we're not hiding anything. Here's all the information. Prior immunity is effective, and the vaccine is effective. You get prior immunity, it's a chance you die from that. So go for the vaccine, because less chance you're going to die from that.
They think we can't handle the truth, and as a consequence, fewer people trust them.
Right.
Trust them.
Trudeau could be guilty in the eyes of the people that he's assailing of hate speech, right?
Yeah, so many American people, talk to me and they're like, is this really happening in Canada? And I'm like, yeah, like this is actually happening. Like these measures are being taken. And for me, as I wrote about in my essay, it's just so remarkable how the word fascist, authoritarian, tyranny, white supremacy were so loosely used during the Trump years. Yet what's happening right now is more authoritarian, arguably, than anything Trump ever did. And I'm no Trump apologist. I was heavily critical of him and never once supported him. And I thought his presidency was disastrous in many other ways. But when it comes to government overreach, when it comes to authoritarianism, like seizing bank accounts and removing insurance of truckers and freezing the bank accounts of not just those who were involved in the protests, but those who donated to the protests, like this is the kind of stuff that people feared Trump would do. Yet this is kind of what's happening right here. And the media is largely silent on it because of the financial incentives, because of their ideological bias.